Hello and welcome to Decarbonize, the clean energy podcast from Fresh Energy. Fresh Energy is a Minnesota nonprofit working to speed our state's transition to a clean energy economy. My name is Brianna Kerber. I am Fresh Energy's Policy Communications Associate, and today I'm here with you to share a recording of our recent webinar called What's Up with the Inflation Reduction Act. This webinar dug into both the good and bad elements of the bill, its implications for equity and justice, as well as how Fresh Energy and advocates around the country are continuing to plug in to drive bold progress toward our carbon-free future. You will be hearing from three Fresh Energy staff members in this webinar: Michael Noble, our Executive Director, Anjali Bains, our Lead Director of Energy Access and Equity, and Joe Olson, our Senior Director of Communications and Engagement. All right, let's jump in.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to today's extremely informal webinar. My name is Joe Olson and my pronouns are she, her. I'm the Communications Director at Fresh Energy. And if you're joining us for the first time and you haven't heard of us, Fresh Energy is a Minnesota-based nonprofit working toward a vision of a just, prosperous, and resilient future powered by a shared commitment to a carbon-neutral economy. So when I initially pitched this webinar to Michael and Anjali and Justin Fay, our Public Affairs Director, I was thinking we would just do an episode of Decarbonize the Clean Energy podcast, but there was so much excitement around the Inflation Reduction Act that I thought, hey, let's do kind of a live webinar recording of the podcast. We'll try something new. So that's why this event is happening today, less than 24 hours notice, less than 24 hours after the bill was signed into law. And I think this is going to be a lot of fun. So thank you everyone for joining us in real time. And if it's not already obvious, the team at Fresh Energy is pretty excited about the Inflation Reduction Act and what it will mean for nationwide decarbonization. So I'm joined today by two of my colleagues, Michael Noble and Anjali Bains. So let's go around the horn and do quick introductions with them. But first, folks joining us in the Zoom room, please use that chat to introduce yourselves, share your pronouns, and where you're logging in from. Okay, Michael, kick us off.
So I'm Michael Noble, and I'm the Executive Director at Fresh Energy. And why am I excited to be here? I'm excited to be here because this bill became law yesterday. It's not a bill anymore. It's a law.
Anjali.
Hi all, great to be here. My name is Anjali Bains, she, her pronouns, and I lead the Energy Access and Equity team here at Fresh Energy. And I'm excited to be here to mark the passing with y'all of this incredible piece of legislation that, while by no means perfect, is a huge step forward by the US Congress on climate change as well as healthcare and taxes.
Thanks, Anjali. So now let's get to why you're both here and everyone in the Zoom room is here. The US Congress and President Biden made climate history by passing the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022 into law. In response to President Biden signing the bill yesterday, I wanted to sit down and talk about how we got here and the implications for Minnesota and all the states in our country for the bill. So full disclosure to folks joining us today, we will not be unpacking the bill line by line today. There's plenty of time for that later. But first, let's just talk numbers. How much money is behind this bill and what will it do for emissions? Anjali?
Yeah, great. So this law is ultimately a $369 billion climate and tax package that constitutes the largest investment in climate action ever in US history. And about 60 billion of that is meant to flow to and support communities overburdened by pollution and other environmental injustices. So it's well known at this point, as we've been going through the law, that the IRA will impact many facets of America's energy, housing, and transportation systems and give a lot more investments to clean energy.
Thanks. And Michael, let's talk emissions.
Yeah, so there's three different estimates from three different sources, but they all center around the idea that it cuts emissions more and more and more each year. But by the year 2030, this decade, it'll cut approximately 1 billion metric tons annually. So more and more and more carbon reductions every year. But by 2030, we'll reach 1 billion metric tons annually, which is most of the way to the president's goal of cutting US emissions in half.
Thanks, Michael and Anjali. Those numbers are really significant. So let's talk about how the Inflation Reduction Act, or the IRA, as I'm just going to call it to simplify things from here on out. Let's talk about how the IRA came to be and its journey through Congress to the president's desk. And also today, we're going to discuss some of the major decarbonization elements of the bill as well, and what the bill does and does not do in terms of equity and justice. So, Michael, at Fresh Energy, we've been calling the IRA a game changer. But just a few weeks ago, climate and energy advocates across the country, you, me, all of us, were in total despair. Congressional staffers were holding sit-ins in Speaker Schumer's office. So how did we get here?
Well, this would be a longer conversation. People are welcome to listen to Dave Roberts' podcast, who talks for an hour about how we got here. But what I'd like to say is that, first of all, the American climate movement, including businesses, labor unions, environmental groups, environmental justice groups, we got our act together about 5 years ago, and we prioritized standards and investment and environmental justice instead of limiting emissions, controlling emissions, cutting carbon by regulation, and taxing carbon and pricing carbon. It was just a pivot on strategy. And this strategy worked because every part of the Democratic coalition embraced the strategy. And in the end, every Democrat voted for the bill. I just have to shout out to Senator Schumer, the majority leader in the Senate, and, God love him, Senator Manchin. They put this bill together kind of after everybody thought it had crashed and burned and was over, and the internet was cursing Senator Manchin. The two of them just rolled up their sleeves and kept at it. But I also have to call out United States Senator Tina Smith and her fabulous staffer, Pete Wyckoff. The Washington Post wrote that Pete and Tina started the Never Give Up Coalition, and they got Senator Hickenlooper and Senator Wyden and a few other senators just to keep badgering and badgering and badgering Senator Manchin and Senator Schumer to make a damn deal, and they did. So I'd like to send my appreciation to dozens and dozens of congressional staffers who worked thousands and thousands of hours around the clock, but especially to our United States Senator Tina Smith. Again, the three things, the three-legged stool, were standards, investment, and environmental justice. And the budget reconciliation caused the standards piece to get thrown overboard. So this bill is essentially investment and environmental justice.
Thank you, Michael. So I'm going to jump in here really quick with a quick plug for our action alert. Fresh Energy has an action alert up on our website for folks to send a thank you note to members of the Minnesota delegation who voted in favor of the IRA getting it through Congress. So for those of you keeping track at home, that's Senators Tina Smith and Amy Klobuchar, and Representatives Angie Craig, Betty McCollum, Dean Phillips, and Ilhan Omar. So I'm going to copy the link into the chat right now, so you all can do this as you have time. But now, to get back to the question of how did we get here? Anjali, anything to add?
Yeah, just to echo what Michael said, this was really the result of persistent pressure from grassroots organizations, youth movements, nonprofits, businesses, labor, and many other people. And this was not written over a mere few weeks. It's really been built up over the immense advocacy and effort of many leaders and organizations from the Build Back Better days and earlier, as Michael mentioned, back in 2017. So it's quite an achievement and really shows what comes of dedicated pressure and passion. And I'm also sure that many of the people on this call today also sent a letter to President Biden or their electeds via the Fresh Energy Action Alert system that Joe just referenced. And that kind of outreach and advocacy was hugely magnified across the country and again, really underscored the passion and urgency of getting something done.
Thanks, Anjali. And let's pause here for a quick moment of clarification. So in late 2021, Congress passed and the president signed into law the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. So that bill also made strong strides for clean energy and energy-related economic development, focused on things like jobs, economic development and tax updates, clean power, buildings and energy efficiency, transportation, and more. But that bill is totally different from the IRA, both in how the money is invested and how it is administered. Michael, can you give this group just like a quick 101 about how they're different? I just want to clear that up before we move forward.
Okay, the very simple thing is the IIJA is like a bonding bill. It's an infrastructure bill. It's a capital investment bill in infrastructure. And the most important thing is that the Inflation Reduction Act is 10 times more carbon reduction, maybe more than 10 times. It's vastly more of a climate bill than an infrastructure bill. Although there were a lot of good infrastructure things in the infrastructure bill, like high-speed car charging on the freeways, and we actually have a long blog post that you can find on our website of all the cool infrastructure that's climate related, but it was not a climate bill. This bill is a tax and spend bill, taxing corporations that were underpaying and spending on climate and healthcare. But climate is the big winner here because well, I like to point out that when they started talking about budget reconciliation, Senator Sanders, the chairman of the budget committee, wanted a $6.5 trillion bill. And the president said, no, we're not going to do $6.5 trillion. Maybe we could do $3 trillion, Bernie. And then Joe Manchin said, nope, we're not going to do $3 trillion. Maybe we could do $1.5 trillion. But this bill is $700 million in taxes and $400 million in spending. So Senator Manchin was able to say that it's reducing the deficit. So this is less than 1/10 of the spending that Bernie Sanders originally wanted. It's almost 1/10 of the spending that President Biden wanted, but the climate provisions are mostly intact. That's what's amazing here, is that of all the coalitions and all the constituencies and all the spending that aspired to be in the Build Back Better agenda, the climate provisions are the only one that crossed the finish line. Along with the healthcare and the prescription drugs deal, but the healthcare deal is much smaller than the climate deal. So I just like to point out that 30 years of organizing made the Democrats realize they couldn't go home and face the voters without a climate bill. And that's ultimately what happened here. We're a nonpartisan organization. We're not here rooting for Democrats, but essentially the constituency of America who cared about climate made the legislature pass this bill, made the Congress pass this bill.
Thank you, Michael. And I did pop the link to that blog post about IIJA or EJA. Am I the only person who called it EJA in my head? I put that in the chat. So if people want to catch up on exactly what that entails.
Most people call it the bipartisan infrastructure bill, because that was the bill that was voted for by both of the political parties. And this is the bill that was only voted for by all the Democrats and was posed by all the Republicans.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Michael. Let's get back to the IRA. So as of yesterday at, 2:30 Central, it was signed into law by President Biden. So let's talk about two of the big decarbonization MVPs in the bill, which are first, tax credits for clean energy, and second, the clean vehicle credits. So Michael, you're on a roll. Tell us about the clean energy tax credits.
So, tax credits are basically government spending. If the government decides, going to give Joe Olson a tax credit for putting a heat pump in her home, it's the federal government reducing Joe Olson's taxes or giving her a credit on her taxes. But it's what's called a tax expenditure. It's the same as government spending. So the government is giving money to Joe Olson because Joe Olson bought a heat pump. Actually, Joe Olson is buying a heat pump and she will get the tax credit. But these tax credits are all over every single clean energy technology you imagine. There's a couple that got left out I was cheering for. There's no tax credits for e-bikes. That was thrown overboard by Senator Manchin, but there's tax credits for wind power, solar power, batteries, electric vehicles, existing nuclear power plants, new nuclear power plants, heat pumps, insulation, low-income families who switch out their appliances for electric appliances, upgrading your electric panel, which is very interesting to me since we had a bill in the Minnesota legislature to provide grants and assistance for families to upgrade their electric panel. Essentially, think of everything that utilities might want to buy, everything that small businesses might want to buy, everything that households might want to buy in the way of clean energy and climate solutions. A whole bunch of it now has a tax credit in the tax code. So that's what the bill mostly is tax credits for stuff that doesn't produce carbon. And some of it is down in the weeds and people might object to it, like tax credits for fossil fuels that capture carbon emissions and put carbon emissions down in a hole in the ground forever. Some people might say, I wish they didn't give tax credits to that. But that was the price of getting Senator Manchin on board, is that we were basically going to give credits to everything that helped reduce carbon and see what shakes out. And the other amazing thing is these credits, tax credits for clean energy, wind power and solar power aren't new. We've had tax credits since as long as I've been working on this stuff. But the hilarious thing and the terrible thing and the ridiculous thing is that the tax credits expire either every year or every other year or every 3 years or every 4 years. I had one business leader once tell me, he says, imagine you ran a business making wind turbine towers in the Red River Valley, and the federal tax credit had completely expired 3 times in 10 years, and you laid off all your workers 3 times in 10 years. Would you be really driving down your costs because of the federal tax credit? Or would you barely be breaking even, like, oh my God, the damn federal government and their tax credits? So these tax credits are now in place through 2032. For all the things I mentioned, they have tax credits for 10 years. This is putting the energy transition on steroids. This stuff was happening, and now it's going to happen a lot faster than it otherwise would, because the tax credits are 30% often of the entire cost of the technology, 30% tax credits for many of these tax credits. I do want to just mention that the tax credit for EVs is a bit of a mishmash. Senator Manchin didn't want it at all, and Senator Schumer managed to keep it in. And I'm just going to have to reserve judgment on how it all shakes out. What they prioritized is cars that'll be made in America with special minerals and metals that are mined in North America. I'm going to have to reserve judgment on how that'll shake out. But this is going to be great for rural communities, $1 billion in rural renewable energy loans that would, for rural electric cooperatives that would use the exact same clean energy benefits as private companies would use, new tax credits, clean energy tax credits, direct funding for tribal energy innovations, native communities to help everyone benefit from clean energy, investments in modernizing energy generation, investments in modernizing energy transmission, building a modern grid of the future here in Minnesota, Midwest, across the country. One analysis says this is going to save $50 million for households in 2030. $50 million for households. Is it $50 billion? What is it? 50 million. $50 million in households savings, energy savings, cost savings on their electric bill. So all these things in place for 10 years, all these things driving the energy innovation, all these things driving down costs. The overarching strategic idea behind the bill is to make the clean stuff cheap instead of making the dirty stuff expensive. That is the big kind of ideological pivot. After 30 years of trying to figure out how to make fossil fuels more expensive, they decided to make the clean stuff cheap. That is the big intellectual pivot on public policy that made this bill pass into law.
Michael, I can tell you're passionate about this, and tax credits for clean energy are indeed the MVP of the bill. So Anjali, as Michael implied, there's a lot of speculation, kind of some gray areas floating around online about which vehicles will qualify for that clean vehicle credit. But let's set that aside for now. We're not going to speculate, but can you tell us what exactly that clean vehicle credit element of the IRA is?
Sure, definitely. So Clean Vehicle Credit, as it's being called, is a major revamp of the existing 7,500 new electric vehicle federal tax credit that exists. Major improvements include making the incentive available at the point of sale, which is a really, really big change, rather than only kicking in during tax time as it currently does. And this is really important to help actually relieve the cost of buying an EV at upfront instead of having to have someone pay the full cost and then file their taxes however many months later in order to actually get the full amount of the value. It also places an income cap on who can use the credit, with individuals making up to 150,000 and households up to 300,000 eligible. So again, trying to narrow exactly who in the U.S. Can participate in this credit and making it a bit more tailored towards those who are not ultra wealthy. A price cap on the EVs is also in place, with SUVs, vans, and pickups up to 80,000 allowed, and all other types of vehicles up to $55,000 allowed as well. And as Michael mentioned, this tax credit was designed to incentivize North American-made EVs and is split into two parts, with buyers receiving the first half of the incentive if the vehicle is made with a battery that was manufactured or assembled in North America, and buyers receiving the other half of the incentive if the battery is constructed with critical minerals extracted in the US or a country the US has a free trade agreement with or is recycled in North America. And both of these this whole vehicle tax credit will run through 2032. So again, as Michael said, there is a very long runway for this tax credit, as with all the other clean energy tax credit. Now, as Joe mentioned, there's been quite a bit of analysis put out there on what is eligible or not under this new tax credit scheme. So we won't get into that here, but it is a big change and it will require a lot of effort to set up these new processes domestically to meet these goals, and won't necessarily solve the near-term supply crunch we've been seeing with new EVs and other passenger vehicles. That being said, a very exciting new development for these tax credits is the inclusion of a used clean vehicle tax credit called the previously owned clean vehicle credit, which is $4,000 and eligible for folks making up to $75,000 by themselves or $150,000 in a household. And this is completely new. This has not existed at the federal level before, so it was very much a response to the advocacy of a lot of different folks. This used vehicle tax credit can be used for a purchase price up to $25,000. And it is especially exciting to have this used vehicle tax credit because most Americans do not actually purchase a brand new car or truck when they need one. In fact, a proportionate spread of Americans across income brackets purchased a used vehicle for their driving needs. So the impact of the $4,000 credit will be really interesting to see.
Thanks, Anjali. There's just a lot there, so thanks for the overview. So now I do want to focus on some provisions of the IRA that are an issue, starting with the new rules for energy leases for oil and gas exploration and production on federal lands and offshore waters in the Gulf of Mexico and Alaska. Michael, can you fill us in here?
Yeah, so this is a horrible provision. Essentially, if we're going to continue to use public land to develop renewable energy, we have to continue to offer leases to oil and gas industry to drill on public land or in public waters. It's a horrible provision. It's perverse. It's directly linking renewable energy production with fossil fuel production. It's a very bad provision, and Fresh Energy is opposed to it, and we stand with the groups who have working tirelessly all their lives to oppose oil and gas drilling on public land and public waters and offshore. I have read several analyses about how bad is the bad, and without offering too much, I've seen analyses that if the overall theory of the bill is to make clean energy cheap, we're tending to drive down the demand for fossil fuels And many of these leases that are offered now don't even get taken up by the oil industry because they don't want them. They don't have the demand. They don't have the need. So, I'm betting on less fossil fuel consumption, not more. I'm betting that the bad provisions won't be as bad as the bad provisions look, and the good provisions are going to be better than the good provisions look. But I do want to acknowledge that groups have put their whole lives and souls on the line to fight offshore drilling and drilling on public lands. And we oppose further exploration and drilling for fossil fuels on public land. There's also a so-called side deal that Senator Schumer and Manchin announced in their memo when they announced the deal. And a side deal means that they agreed to it in principle, but it's not part of the bill. And the side deal is basically reform of federal permitting and environmental review. Now, this is a double-edged sword because, we absolutely will fight against and all the national organizations, all the expert organizations, all the land organizations, all the legal organizations will fight against any change in the public process that would enable fossil fuel infrastructure to be built more easily. But ironically, we actually need reform of public siting and public review and public permitting for wind farms, solar farms, and transmission. We need reform on that. So when I call it a double-edged sword, we don't want any easing or smoothing of the pathways for fossil fuel infrastructure, but we do want easing and smoothing of the pathways for renewable energy infrastructure. So this is going to be fought out in Congress. This is, when they say it's a side deal, basically Senator Schumer said he would vote for it. Nobody else promised to vote for it.
Thanks, Michael. And do you want to speak at all to how advocates are approaching these not so good elements of the bill?
Well, some frontline communities and justice communities are focusing on these provisions. I saw one analysis that for every ton of carbon dioxide that could conceivably be increased by oil and gas leases, there's 25 tons of carbon dioxide decreased in the bill. So 25 tons of good stuff and 1 ton of bad stuff. That's why on balance we support the bill. But again, if your primary issue is that you are fighting mountaintop removal in Appalachia, and this bill makes better opportunities for removing mountaintops in Appalachia, that's no consolation to you. Or if you've put your life on the line and you're organizing efforts in your treasure fighting a pipeline, and this eases the permitting of a pipeline, that's no consolation. So I acknowledge that the frontline communities and the justice communities are ambivalent about the bill. But again, for every ton of carbon increased in the modeling, there's 25 tons of carbon decreased in the modeling. And I think the modeling is quite conservative, and the good will be better than the good looks, and the bad will be less bad than the bad looks.
Thanks, Michael. And Anjali, let's turn to the equity and environmental justice side of the bill. So some advocates are contesting that the bill doesn't do enough, kind of as Michael was saying there. Can you share your thoughts with us on that?
Sure, yeah. And there's been a really robust discussion with different groups taking different positions depending on where they're working on or what they're working on, as Michael mentioned. So just wanted to share that is dynamic and is by no means a monolith when we're talking about all these different organizations with different priorities. But the IRA is a great step, but it's by no means perfect, as we're starting to see. While it falls in the spirit of the Biden administration's Justice Forward initiative in that equity and environmental justice are woven throughout many of the provisions, thanks in many ways to persistent advocacy of environmental and climate justice leaders, it actually falls short right now of ensuring that 40% of its climate investments are going to go towards what are called disadvantaged communities. In other words, the communities most harmed by our existing power, industrial, and transportation systems, who are living right next to polluting facilities and who are bearing the worst impacts from our changing climate and who are least resourced to mitigate and adapt to it. That can include rural communities, Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities, and what we call under-resourced communities. So this bill is doing a lot, but it's not quite getting to that 40%. As I mentioned earlier, about 60 billion of the almost 370 billion of the IRA is meant to go towards these communities, but that's actually only 16% of the entire investment, so far below what the Build Back Better legislation would have given, which would have been about 160 billion, and also below what the Justice 40 initiative would have committed, which is that 40%. And as Michael mentioned, the risk of permitting reform makes it easier to, could make it easier to cite or continue to cite polluting industries in these communities. And that is a real risk and one we all need to fight against with as much passion as we put into celebrating the IRA. On that front, the prominent New York City-based environmental justice organization, WE ACT, is hosting a webinar tomorrow to talk about the risk of permitting reform. And you can sign up for that chat in the link, which I will pop in the chat
I
here.
can do it, Anjali.
Oh, great, awesome. Gives me a little bit less multitasking. So again, that is a webinar put on by WE ACT, which is a Northern Manhattan-based environmental justice organization. Finally, as some folks online have pointed out, this is a legislation of incentives, as Michael even mentioned, which is to say a lot of carrots and no regulatory sticks, or other form of stricter standards. So standards and regulations are important policy tools that, when enforced consistently and widely, can protect us all, and especially the communities most hurt by pollution. So there'll need to continue to be some advocacy on permitting reform and making sure that more of the IRA investments are being sent to the communities who need it most, and that those communities are able to participate in these federal processes, and that is always made easier so that there's more and more input given by the communities most impacted by our climate pollution. We'll also need to keep pushing for more protections and regulations that reduce and prevent harm as much as the IRA incentivizes clean action.
Well put. Thank you, Anjali. Okay, now, well, since I have you both, I want to ask about some other elements of the bill that you yourselves are especially excited about. As Michael implied, I will be bringing heat pumps into my home, so that's what I'm excited about. But there are some other really cool, familiar things in the IRA that are cribbed from original language of the Build Back Better Act. So for our listeners, I'm going to post again this blog of like the 17 things that the Fresh Energy team was excited about. But now I want each of you to share your personal faves, and you can just pick a few. Michael, why don't you start?
So, when we wrote that blog, 17 favorite things on the Fresh Energy staff, I joke it's like you go into the bookstore and where the employees get to put the tag on the book. These are my favorite books. But, to actually figure out which your favorite books are, you have to read all the books, maybe. And there's 750 pages in this bill. And every day I learn something new in the bill. I mean, that I didn't know when that blog went out. So, for example, the Green Bank. $1 million, because is $1 million a lot of money or is it not very much money? There's $27,000 million commitments for a green bank, most of it focused on equity and justice communities. So that's pretty amazing to me, 27,000 million investments of $1 million, or 27,000 investments of $1 million in climate justice and energy justice in communities. There's going to be a whole new industry of green banking in America. That's remarkable. And that idea made it to the finish line. One of the friends of Fresh Energy, keynote speaker at one of our benefit breakfasts was Jigar Shah. I think most people who are the insiders, they know that he now works for the United States Department of Energy in the loan guarantee program. He got a massive new authorization of spending. Now, the funny thing is an authorization is not the same as an appropriation. You have to get the Congress to come back and appropriate the money after the Congress has authorized it. But he's basically making loan guarantees for massive game-changing projects and technologies, guaranteeing loans so that private banks and private investors don't have to take the risk on state-of-the-art new stuff that we definitely are going to need. He got an enormous expansion of his budget authority. Now the Congress has to come back and appropriate the money. But this is something that actually Republicans and Democrats like, is the idea of guaranteeing against the risk of failure, even though they had that terrible PR nightmare when they lent money to Solyndra. They had that incredible PR success when they loaned money to a little company that had a little sports car called Tesla. That the Tesla Corporation wouldn't exist without the federal loan guarantee program. So those are the two things in the bill that I did not know about when our 17 favorite things went out: the green bank provision and the enormous expansion of funding authorization for the United States Department of Energy loan guarantee program under Jigar Shah.
All right, pop quiz for both of you. In 2 sentences, define green banking. We've got a question in the chat. And actually, I could use a 2-sentence quick
Angela, you
rundown.
want to try? Do you want to try?
Sure. And Michael, please. I think you've done some reading on this. So Green Bank is this concept of basically creating a fund to finance a number of clean energy projects. It could be something like solar panels or a more efficient energy efficiency systems and things like that. And then it'll be financed from this green bank, and the person who's benefiting from the loan is basically just going to pay it back to the loan provider, so the green bank in this case. And it's meant to be cheaper than getting a commercial loan because a lot of banks don't necessarily have the expertise to do clean energy financing in this way. And it generally has like a more steady rate of return and then success, because those loans can then be, once they're paid back, can be put towards more clean energy financing projects. So it's a really great way to keep passing the buck forward and building clean energy change. Michael, did I get it?
I think that's perfect. I couldn't do better.
Not 2 sentences, but perfect, and like a perfect explainer. I feel like maybe we have to do a blog post about that in the future. All right. So Anjali, your favorite things, go.
Yeah, so as we were talking about earlier, there are a few gaps and shortfalls in the legislation, but there are also the establishment of entirely new funds that are meant to address past environmental injustices. 2 main ones being the Environmental and Climate Justice Block Grant Program and the Neighborhood Access and Equity Grant Program, which are both funded at $3 billion each. The latter program in particular, the Neighborhood Access and Equity Grant, is meant to fund efforts to reconnect communities harmed by transportation facilities like highways, and to support community engagement in transportation planning. So again, trying to shore up the public input process of these major transportation decisions. This is especially timely in a place like the Twin Cities, when our Minnesota Department of Transportation is undergoing a once-in-a-lifetime process to rebuild I-94, which our friends, Our Street Minneapolis, have been engaging heavily in alongside communities along the highway in order to propose an alternative that would decrease climate and air pollution and reconnect the neighborhoods that were torn apart by the highways build 50 years ago. And this is really critical, because not only is it a once in a lifetime opportunity to change how we move around the Twin Cities and decentralize the use of our personal vehicles, it is probably the only opportunity to be able to get before those climate cliffs that we know so well coming in the middle of the century. So it's a great initiative, and you can check out more about the Twin Cities Boulevard project, as it's being called, on the website, which I think Joe will put into the chat. And finally, in a bit of a twist, as we're talking about permitting reform, one of the issues that is a barrier to quicker and more timely permitting processing for things like large renewables as well is lack of funding in state agencies to actually process and go through all the applications. So the IRA actually puts more funding towards better implementing our bedrock national permitting legislation, and is giving $750 million to help implement the National Environmental Protection Act, or NEPA as it's called. And then a really fun fact that I really enjoy and is often overlooked when we talk about the IRA is that the IRA is also giving $3 billion to the US Postal Service to go electric, which will be really fun to see and was really necessary to help keep pushing them towards electrification.
Thanks, Anjali. So the bill signing was an incredible accomplishment for all of those who worked on this inside Congress and outside. an accomplishment for the planet, for the youth climate movement, and all of us who've been demanding this day for a really long time now. So just we should pause and stress that the IRA is not a silver bullet. Michael, can you talk about how groups like Fresh Energy and then how Minnesotans and everyone around the country can continue pushing for further meaningful, impactful climate action?
Okay, so again, going back to the big picture, the President of the United States went to Glasgow, the United Nations IPCC gathering, and he said, America's commitment, America's contribution to the deal here is we'll cut our emissions more than half this decade, by 50% to 52% by 2030. And I already told you this bill gets us most of the way there. There's uncertainty. Does it get us 70% of the way there, or does it get us 75% of the way there? Does it get 80? Who knows? That's uncertainty. But getting our emissions cut in half is actually not the goal. The goal is getting our emissions to zero. And we got a couple, 3 decades to do it. Everybody says by mid-century, my number is by 2040, that there are no more human emissions. It's zero, it's net zero. It's eliminated, no emissions. So of course this bill isn't enough. Of course this bill isn't the end game. This bill gives us a chance. And how are we going to get America's emissions cut in half by this decade? Well, invest in Fresh Energy's work. Invest in other nonprofits who we're allied with. Continue to build the movement. Continue to work on the state legislature. Continue to work at the Minnesota Public Utilities Commission. Continue to work with City Hall. Continue to work with the county board. Continue to work with the private corporations that are making initiatives. Continue to persuade the management and the board of directors of Minnesota's fabulous utilities, our investor-owned utilities, our cooperative utilities, our municipal utilities. They can all go beyond. These, remember, there's no carrot, there's no sticks, it's just carrots. They can eat as many carrots as they want. So urge everybody to go faster, have Minnesota be the place that puts this transition on steroid. What could the president do? The president could declare a national emergency. He could declare a national climate emergency. We've already called on him to do that. A national climate emergency, I think it's an emergency. It's an emergency. We're in an emergency situation. It unlocks new administrative power and regulatory tools that the president has under current law. So he could declare a national emergency. There's going to be a lot of political pressure on him not to, because you could say, well, we did that bill. Remember we did that bill? But we could also have the president, without declaring a national emergency, use all his procurement strategy. The federal government buys a lot of stuff. They could buy a lot of stuff that's carbon free. They could just announce, we're going to only buy carbon free steel in all the vehicles we buy in 2026. There will be no vehicles the federal government will ever buy unless the steel comes from carbon free sources. That would be good for the carbon free steel industry. That would be very good for the carbon free steel industry. He doesn't need any congressional action to declare that. He could just declare that. How do we get to zero emissions in every aspect of human society? Some people were complaining about a provision in the bill for sustainable aviation fuels. Do you ever fly in an airplane? Do you ever wonder, are you going to be able to fly in an airplane that has no carbon emissions? We have to invent airplanes that don't have any carbon emissions. So there's provisions in the bill to get started on aviation fuels that don't have carbon. That's going to require some compromises with people who don't like biofuels. Maybe the next generation of biofuels is going to be Delta Airlines is going to be an important customer. I don't know how it works out. I don't have the answers. But what I know is that this bill, signed into law by President Biden yesterday, is humanity's best chance to solve the problem. I know that.
Thank you, Michael. I think that's like a really powerful note to close out the webinar. But before we do that, I always like to open up the floor to my guests, our panelists, and say, is there anything that either of you would like to add before we sign off? Anything burning? I mean, initially with the fuel thing, I thought, Taylor Swift and her airplanes. But that's not the type of thing we're looking for here. What did you not get to bring up today that you want to close with before we sign off. And nothing is okay too. We've talked about a lot. What do we miss?
Yeah, I think just to kind of build off Michael's passion in how much this bill accomplishes, I've seen equal passion from those on the front lines talking about everything that was missed. And I think as we're talking about this change and bring down emissions, as we all know, like this is also like the really big opportunity for us to actually change the systems of how we consume power and move and build our homes, so that we're also righting a lot of the injustices that have happened due to past decision making. And I think the just knowledge and acknowledgement that everything's interrelated and we can do more and should be doing more to help right those wrongs is really crucial, as well as we're aiming to get to those net zero emissions by mid-century.
Thanks, Anjali. Michael?
So, there's so many people to thank and acknowledge, the legislators themselves. We already shouted out Tina Smith, who was really one of the top 5 United States senators, who was a climate hero, and her staff guy, Pete Wyckoff, who was, I didn't put him on speed dial because I want to bother him, but I texted him a bunch. There's so many people to thank, organizers, activists, the lobbyists, the private companies, the labor unions. But the 3 people I think get most credit are these 3. All the youth climate activists worldwide who made this the burning issue, starting with that little girl sitting in front of the damn school in Sweden, and a guy who ran for president and put up 200 pages of climate policy. The governor of Washington State, Jay Inslee, made every single Democrat who wanted to be president have a fantastic climate policy because they were trying to keep up with Jay Inslee. And a lady from Atlanta, Georgia, Stacey Abrams, who sent 2 Democratic senators that gave 50 votes and put Joe Manchin and Chuck Schumer in a damn cage match for almost 2 years to figure out what could they both agree on. Joe Manchin representing the fossil fuel industry and the coal industry, and Chuck Schumer representing the other 49 senators, or 48 of them anyway. And they made a deal, and the president signed it. So as broken as our democracy is, this worked. We passed this bill. This worked.
Thank you both so much. You guys, you're absolute pros. Thank you for being here, doing this on such short notice, sharing your knowledge with myself and the group. And I also want to acknowledge that everyone on the webinar today, just like even being here and engaging this in it and learning about the IRA and how we got here and the EJA before it, and all that support over weeks, months, years has gone a really long way. So thank you everyone for joining us.
Thank you for tuning in to the audio recording of our webinar. You can stay up to date on Fresh Energy's work at fresh-energy.org or follow us on social media. I hope to also see many of you online this fall in October for our 2022 virtual Benefit Breakfast. The Benefit Breakfast is an annual event that we really look forward to each year, and this year we are sitting down with special guests Julian Brave Noisecat, Ryan Panchadsaram, and more for an inspiring discussion about continuing to work together to drive an ambitious climate and clean energy agenda at this really pivotal moment in human history. You can RSVP today at fresh-energy.org/benefitbreakfast. Thank you to everyone listening for subscribing to our podcast. You can support Fresh Energy's work by donating today. To do so, head to our website at fresh-energy.org and click Donate in the upper right corner. Thanks for tuning in.